Hello everyone and welcome back to Deckled Edges. I'm your host Camilla, and today we are back with another episode. This time it's about The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. Now, this book is unlike many of the others we have covered on this podcast. We've covered some historical fiction, we've covered some psychological fiction, and a bunch of fantasy too. But this book is more of a non-fiction, narrative-centric kind of book, which is something that I have always loved but never really had the opportunity to really delve into too deeply. But I'm glad to have that opportunity now and to share with you some things that I think are most important in this book, most important to highlight. Not necessarily just plot, because I think this is one of those books that has a repetitive base and then really builds off of that and intrigues you but has a rhythm to it that doesn't necessarily keep you on the edge of your seat. So I think there's a lot of things that you could definitely go into with this book that doesn't require a lot of plot explanation, but more so analysis of how the characters are reacting within a certain situation. And for whatever reason that you are tuning in today, I'm so glad you're here. And if you are a repeat listener or first time listener, I think that today we're going to cover a lot of things that will be really useful to you for whatever purposes you want to learn about this book about. If it's just for enjoyment, I think that you'll find some compelling things that will draw you in and encourage you to actually sit down and read this book. But if not, if you're just looking for a summary or some important themes to hit or character analysis, you'll definitely find that here today too. A lot of character analysis, like I was saying. I think that's what really drives this book and what makes it such a compelling piece of literary journalism, and more so because of how the author kind of clocks Breitweiser and everything that he does, and really does a good job of coupling Breitweiser's retelling of the events and kind of really expressing to the reader how well the thief himself remembers every one of his thefts and has a very special connection with each one of them, to the point where he can literally recount them over the course of 7 years. Not everyone has that ability, but also being able to illustrate to the reader the intricacy and the details, and also have a educated literary opinion that he's able to convey. So you can really tell that the author's voice is present throughout this novel, but it's also more so of a biopic in novel version, as you would say, of a person and their life and their story and the one thing, or actually in his case, two things that made his world go round. So, jumping right in, right off the bat, the first thing that you learn when you open the book is a depiction of one of Breitweiser's crimes. It's not his first one, it's not his last one, it's one in between, but it's intentionally chosen, I believe, because it's an example of what sets Breitweiser apart. By the way, I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but don't clock me on that because it's not my fault. But yeah, like I was saying, the main hook to this character, the main character of the story, is that he steals not for profit or not for to increase his social standing, but he steals out of an innate desire and appreciation for art, or so he says. He has always claimed and always continues to claim, even until the end, that the reason that he steals is because of an intense feeling of love and appreciation, and he's just floored and overcome by a heartfelt passion for this art, to the point where he feels like he must possess this art. Seeing it is not enough. He has to be able to feel it. He has to be able to be surrounded by it in his everyday life. That's what makes him such a compelling character, because he has a motive, and he's a real person, so it's not like some made-up character that feels a little bit strange, but his motive is purely from his own soul. It's purely human, rather than some contrived desire to further your own monetary gain. There's a lot of examples in this book, which is something that I think that you should be able to highlight, or you should be able to take notice of, where Michael Finkel showcases his real research into the world of art theft and the world of art in general and art appreciation and how it's changed hands over the years. But you can really tell where he gives examples of crews and people who have stolen prolific pieces of art in the past in order to make a quick buck, but they come to realize it's a little harder than they think. One example that Finkel brings up in his book that I thought was interesting was the theft of 118 Picassos at once from an exhibition at the Papal Palace in France in 1976. And this just kind of shows how juvenile a lot of these crimes are, how haphazard, without real regard for the art or real care for or appreciation for the emotional connection that they have to the art. They don't. They just go in and take it hoping to make money off of it. And it also goes to show the way that the art was recovered. It goes to show the inexperiencedness with which a lot of these art thieves go into their first big project in the art world, and they don't really understand how to handle it or what they're dealing with. Whereas Breitwieser does his research, he has that connection that sets him apart. He has that experience, that practiced calm demeanor that, makes him so dangerous to, not necessarily as a person, but as a thief. He is so well versed in it, especially with Anne Catherine, who I'll introduce in a second. But a lot of this book is spent displaying and really drilling into the reader's mind what sets Breitwieser apart from the rest of the art-stealing world. And to be honest with you, I don't think that this book necessarily paints him in a positive or negative light. I think that there is a certain careful and controlled demeanor with which Finkel portrays Breitwieser, because as is revealed at the end of the book, he actually spent a lot of time with him in order to research for this novel. He became a sort of, I don't know if friends is the right word, but formed a camaraderie in order to really gain this information and be able to speak candidly, or get Breitwieser to speak candidly to him. And in that, you do kind of form a sort of tentative friendship, and so you have to be careful with how you're portraying someone to the world, because you're trying to write a piece of journalistic literature. But I really think it's interesting how Breitwieser's often, his neuroticism is put on display, and really a lot of the little things that make him tick, that really personify him to the reader, are really interesting details caught by Finkel. For example, how Anne Catherine and him are always in this second-hand designer clothing, which obviously adds to their disguise, but is a kind of extra touch that shows a consideration and a careful gathering of experience over time. In addition, his real dedication to learning and gaining a knowledge of art is really incredible. And in one of the earlier chapters, Finkel describes how after thefts, or sometimes on weekends in his free time, he's unemployed, so he has a lot of free time, but he'll read this dictionary of artists, this encyclopedia, and multiple kinds of these. This is just one example, but he'll read artistic journals, he'll read documents and clippings and all sorts of things about art in order to learn about it. He basically scrutinizes catalogs and annotated listings of works by certain artists, and he'll trace paintings' backgrounds and provenances, and how many times it exchanged hands, or which royal family owned it. And he'll do all this research, and yet he'll grow this attachment to the art that he researches. You kind of see not just a descent into madness, so to speak, as time goes on, a descent into liking the theft itself rather than maintaining this pure appreciation for art, but at the same time you also see him becoming more and more addicted to art, and really as he learns more, as he gains more pieces, this obsession grows. And you really see this over the course of the novel, and you see it starting to, at the beginning of the novel, I think one of the most important observations is how Michael Finkel really, the author, really makes the reader understand that the two great important things that make Breitwieser want to keep living are Anne Catherine, his girlfriend, and the art. There's nothing else in the world. And maybe his mother is often added as a footnote to this duality that keeps him alive. And it's really made to seem throughout the novel, and you really understand through the examples, that without these things, his life becomes out of balance, unguided. He's unemployed. He doesn't have a life outside of this art or outside of Anne Catherine. He doesn't have a purpose. He doesn't have an education beyond art and beyond Anne Catherine. Those are the two things that he knows best, other than stealing, and that he could not live without. And you really start to see this gaining a hold on him. And what's most interesting to me, I think, is how, as this obsession with art grows, as his bank of knowledge grows, as the scrapbook of thefts and his wall space becomes increasingly cluttered, and you just kind of get this feeling that he's on a downward spiral, on this like endless landslide of never being able to stop, and you get this feeling that he'll never be satisfied. You see the scale start to tip. You see his love for Anne Catherine start to become second to his obsession with art. And you see how maybe his love for Anne Catherine, while his love is more so becoming or coming to mirror this obsession with art. It's becoming more so an obsession, something that he believes he owns and that he is always going to have, rather than something that he is putting real effort into maintaining. His relationship with Anne Catherine, while seemingly strong, is also built on a foundation of theft and art. Without art, this relationship with Anne Catherine becomes strained, and with too much theft, the relationship with Anne Catherine becomes strained. And without Anne Catherine, art loses its luster. So it's like an endless catch-22 of he has to have those two things. But when the balance starts to shift towards art, when this obsession grows too large for Anne Catherine to handle, it comes to the point where she gives him an ultimatum, and it starts to boil over. And this seemingly perfect relationship, that, not perfect obviously, but aligned at least, they're on the same page for a lot of it, regardless of whether he is more naive, he has this more like altruistic view of what he's doing, whereas Anne Catherine has a more practical view. They're still relatively on the same page about this pace, about this fervency to the stealing, but we find that, as I was saying, when the scales start to shift, when his two worlds start to become a little bit unbalanced, we see a lot of what he's built start to begin to crumble and begin to really fall out of whack. One of my favorite examples of this whole book, from when Stefan and Anne Catherine were in their rhythm, were really in the thick of their stealing, and really you come to the middle of the book at the point where they're not at the beginning yet where they're tentative, they're not at the end where it starts to get overly obsessive and thieving for the sake of it, but they're right at the sweet spot where he still steals for the deep appreciation of art, but he's starting to cross that line a little bit, but he's experienced enough that stealing is no longer a burden to him, and it just becomes this kind of game. He's in his prime, I'd say, at this point. And I just think it's one of those examples that doesn't fall victim to the repetitive motion of this book in which it's just another theft, but it has another layer to it that really showcases Breitwieser's ingenuity and what makes him such a unique character, and the reason that he's worthy of having a novel about him, I'd say, beyond just his theft. So what actually happens in this theft is that they're in the Art and History Museum in Brussels. And Breitwieser actually off the bat thinks that another thief had been in this museum. He sees that he usually, after he takes from a display case, he reorganizes the pieces to look as if nothing had happened. But in this case, they look a little disorderly. They look strewn about. And so his first knee-jerk reaction is, wow, someone beat me to it. But in another moment, he notices a note card, a folded index card in the case that says objects removed for study. So he takes his trusty Swiss Army knife and grabs the index card. You think at first glance, you think he's going to take an object and just leave it as it was, but he actually takes the tool, an unsuspecting, unusual, and very ordinary object, a piece of index card that he turns into a tool to use for his own gain, to use for this craft that he's basically perfected at this point. If you say that someone is a master at something, Breitwieser really is. Like, even when he gets caught, it's almost like completely unnecessary. Like, it was just a moment of comfort. But how do you get so good at something so dangerous and so on the line that you get comfortable and then you get caught, which I guess happens a lot with criminals, but at the same time, you have to understand how good he is at this. That the one time he gets caught is because he does it a little too conspicuously and just makes the wrong decision and doesn't go with his gut for one time. But that's, I'll get to that in a bit later. But right now, he takes this index card and he swipes it, and you think he's going to take something from the display case, but he actually uses it to basically go on a theft spree throughout the entire museum. This chapter is also when we get to know Breitwieser's passion ranking. He calls it his personal passion ranking of his favorite mediums to have, or to possess, or to steal, however you would like to call it. First is oil paint, he says. Third is ivory. And then, in a nice play of words, silver gets the silver. But he prefers a specific kind. And he says it's around 16th century, around Protestant towns. They're called Augsburg and Nuremberg. Shout out Peace of Augsburg, AP Euro. But he describes there was a competition that erupted between master silversmiths that just inspired this period of incredibly over-the-top, intricate, exuberant works of silver being created, which is the kinds, including the Fabergé eggs, that royal families possessed at the time, and the kind that naturally Breitwieser prefers. So it kind of goes to show that yes, there are, unique pieces that he has his eye on, that he really gets this reaction to, but he also sort of has a pattern of behavior that ends up kind of coming back to haunt him, but not necessarily, but in a sense. And so, in line with these passions, which I think are an important detail to really have in your mind and your brain about, he is quite an erratic character, but he does have patterns. He has things that call to him specifically. And anyway, in line with these passions, he finds this display case that is particularly this specific kind of silver that he likes. And so, using this unsuspecting, ordinary tool of an index card that says objects removed for study, he brilliantly just grabs a bunch of silver and puts the card in place. And it's really just such a simple plan, but it really shows how this character thinks, how he's able to think about how he can use every possible piece of detail from his situation, from his surroundings, and use it to his advantage. He becomes this kind of weird evil mastermind, but he's not actually evil, he's just misguided in a sense. I don't know. There is this kind of conclusion that you have to draw about him at the end of the novel, but a lot of times that conclusion might just be he's just a strange person, I think. But anyway, so he takes a lot of this silver. He takes goblets of nautilus and coconut, and one of the interesting things about this one particular example is that he has to go back and find the lid, because according to him, every object that he takes has to be whole, complete as he found it. Because, again, he has this appreciation for art, and he's not planning on selling it. But it just is such an interesting, piece of this, character examination of his neuroticism and his, specific necessity for everything to be exactly how he needs it to be and how he's used to it being. And it kind of goes to show his overall lifelong immaturity. He has a lot of flaws that can be attributed in part to his parents, to his situation, but a lot of the time he just comes off as a bit spoiled, and you have to wonder if throughout all these psychological evaluations that Finkel includes in this story, if it, really does stem from this lack of attention as a child, and all of these, little factors, and, his mother dotes on him, but only to get back in his father, and his father's just disappointment, and a lot of these little things that build up over time to go to show you that at its root, I think it might just be that a lot of his behavior can be attributed to his early life and his just residual immaturity from that. In addition to just being one of the cooler examples of this book, I think that this also kind of marks the point where he gets a little braver. I think, before this he's been bold with his crimes and stuff like that, but at this point, when they come back, they actually leave the museum and then revisit a couple months later, and he actually uses the exact same formula, the exact same method, and takes the biggest object in the display case, this silver warship that kind of becomes a symbol, in my opinion, of the prime of his career, and then at the end of the book, his eventual downfall, as it comes up in the river. And it's just this kind of push and pull, this symbolism of how, even at his prime, it's kind of this like foreshadowing of what's to come. I don't know. It not necessarily symbolism, but it's just interesting that these physical objects can have this like duality in his narrative, and surely in his mind too. He must have thought them to be objects worthy of a king at one point, and then more objects of shame afterwards, even though he still does have an appreciation for art that is even palpable in court. But we'll get to that. I also want to talk a little bit about Anne Catherine specifically. I think she's the second most important character in this novel by a mile, and I'll probably skip over talking about Brett Weaser's mom and his dad, because I think that those parental relationships are things that can kind of be inferred, and they hold bearing on the novel, but not in such a drastic way that we need to cover it. But Anne Catherine does, and she's just, like I said, she's one of Brett Weaser's two worlds. She holds a lot of influence in his life and is essentially his partner in crime. But what intrigues me the most is that her motivations remain largely unclear throughout the novel. She is not really like Brett Weaser at all. She doesn't steal for the pure love of art, and she's not enthralled by these pieces. She surely has aesthetic appreciation for them. She probably feeds into this, king and queen type roleplay they have going on. Not necessarily, but you know what I mean. But in a sense, she is the pragmatic one, but she also is not. She's essentially living in a fantasy world for 10 years. She's basically living in this world where they can go in, waltz in, steal whatever they want, go out and basically have this palace in their attic where they have opulent just paintings and ivory and silver and all this rich, lavish lifestyle, when I think in a sense it's kind of a extended delusion, if I had to be honest, because my read of the character and how she's portrayed to the reader a little bit is this delusion is, she's in a committed relationship with this unemployed man. She's a nurse, but she also gets to be this kind of Bonnie and Clyde, like, vigilante, but not really, like a thief essentially. But she has this double life on the side, and she gets away with it. They've gotten away with it for so long. And honestly, you don't really see this passion start to fizzle out until he gets caught. So it's an interesting psychological breakdown of this woman who is really not planning on stopping anytime soon. And honestly, if nothing had happened to them, I don't think that she would ever really get tired and want to stop, because the kind of person she was just, she was willing to go along and play in Brett Weaser's fantasy that it would be like this forever. But when he gets caught in Switzerland for the first time, they're literally walking out in plain daylight with a painting under his arm, not his brightest idea. And the two times he gets caught are the times that he doesn't trust his gut. And honestly, he gets complacent. So I think that's telling of, what kind of person he is. But, after they get caught in Switzerland, he gets banned from Switzerland and all that kind of thing, it kind of starts to change their relationship a little bit. Because not only are they greatly shaken, but it also, down the line, proves to Anne Catherine that Brett Weaser will not change, and he has started to forego any kind of logical sense that they once had. He once relied on her logic to tell him when or when not to do a theft, or when to take a piece, or when it was too dangerous. But now he's lost that a little bit, and she kind of understands that after he, goes behind her back, betrays her, steals in Switzerland again, he will never change. And this is the beginning of that realization for her. But it also is a weird, understanding of her character to realize that she doesn't trust him. She doesn't see him as necessarily a stable or reliable person, and she recognizes that, but she is still along for the ride. But she doesn't see him as someone who would be a father, or, she knows that he's unreliable, which is a very interesting thing to admit to yourself as a longtime partner, and partner in crime specifically. to someone. I guess it's like an extended fantasy, and it really cements that a big part of Anne Catherine's world is that she's living in this delusion, in this dream world. And that's all I can really say about her character, because at the end, when, it all comes crashing down and the dual storylines of the police investigating Brightweezer and, they catch him outside when he takes this bugle, and Catherine is there. She looks panicked. She tries to warn him. Until the end, she seems that she stays, loyal because, this delusion is only slightly cracked at this point. So she's still living in it. But as they're separated, I believe that this kind of fantasy-tinged, rose-tinged world that she lives in starts to fade a little bit, and she understands that she wants to go back to a normal life, but I think that this shows a lack of integrity in her character, because she's so willing to live in this delusion for so long until something goes wrong and she just jumps ship because she knows that, because the fantasy breaks and she doesn't want to face any real consequences, while she's fully willing to let Brightweezer shoulder that. So it is a complicated situation, but it doesn't lend you to really like her character at all. You understand why she left, and you think she probably should have left sooner, but if she didn't like it that much, why did she facilitate it? Why did she encourage it? Why did she entertain it? Because she wanted to, is the real root of it, and a lot of people wouldn't be willing to admit that, but she does hold fault in the situation, but she also got off scot-free, so there is some morality to that you could call into question. And honestly, the way it's portrayed throughout the whole novel, you kind of believe that Brightweezer is somewhat of a good person. You empathize with his motives a little bit, because you understand that it's not necessarily coming from a place of malice or wanting to rob the public of, right to view art, but it's more so a belief that his right to possess the art is greater than that of the shared common good, and he doesn't really have that moral responsibility to preserve that civic duty or that civic right. But you also, towards the end of the novel, you start to realize that he'll never change, and that frustration that it must feel, even up to the date of his court date, throughout his time in jail, his friend, the framer, who he befriends, who is completely innocent, but you start to cheer them on. You want him to have another friendship in his life that is not just Anne Catherine or art. You feel good for him. He has a friend, a genuine person whom he can share this passion with. But at the end of the novel, you realize this betrayal when he just keeps stealing, because you realize that he's become a thief, and not just an art thief, an art person. He becomes a thief for the sake of it, because he's become obsessed not with art anymore, but with the act, with his mastered craft, because it's the one thing that he has mastered in his life. And I think that's really interesting, and it just kind of breaks your heart a little bit, even if not in a personal way, but more so because you realize that it has gone too far, and it will never change in a sense. But to wrap it up, I truly don't think that this novel leaves you with the impression that he's a bad person. It just leaves you with the impression that he is not a good one, and that he probably will never change, and that he will never stop, and that this negative cycle of obsession has overtaken his life and become who he is, not just a part of who he is anymore. So I think in that sense, Finkel did a really good job at not only showcasing the research that went into this project. You really see this constant comparison of Brightweezer to these other art thieves, and you really understand fundamentally at the end of it why he is different, and are willing to be taken along on this journey. So I thought that was really well done in that sense. You also get to see the complexities of these characters. You see how his neuroticism, his carefully calculated attention to detail is, his mastery of this craft of theft over time, and you really, really understand his workings to an extent at the end of it. And it also is quite entertaining to read the different scenarios, and like I said in the previous example, that was my favorite one, but there's definitely a lot of other examples of the thefts that each have their own little unique twist to it. I liked that it had a flow, it had a rhythm, and even if it was sometimes repetitive, it was good. So overall, I really enjoyed this novel, and I hope you did too, listening to the analysis and some important examples that I hope you keep in mind if you ever have to use this book in any form in the future. But overall, I really enjoyed this book, and I appreciate the candidness and the fact that the author's voice does shine through, and you can also really appreciate how keen of an eye for memory and observation and art that Brightweezer really did have. Thank you so much for joining me today and listening, everyone. I really hope that you enjoyed this episode and that you enjoyed my analysis of The Art Thief by Michael Finkel. I really enjoyed this novel more than I thought I would, and I liked a lot of things about it, so I hope that that comes through in the analysis. I hope that the examples are helpful to you and the characters make a lot more sense now. And I hope you tune into the next episode, and I hope that everyone has a really, really lovely day, afternoon, evening, or night. Thank you so much for listening. Bye.